All right, we're going to go through the fifth section of Vietnam Notes that had three parts. The first part was about the election of 1972. And unlike in 1968, this election was not close, but events that took place during the election did impact what we'll look at with a later reading. So in the election of 1972, it was dominated by foreign policy, obviously being in the midst of the Cold War. Specifically, Vietnam was the focus. And despite in 1968 running on a platform that Nixon would end the war with victory, 4 years later, he's still doing the same thing. He says we're going to end the war and win the peace, as a peace is something that can be won. And so he's the Republican nominee. On the Democratic side, you have a South Dakota senator named George McGovern, and he said that within days of taking office, he would remove troops from Vietnam. And so obviously he's going to draw support from the war doves. There's not a ton of excitement in this election. Nixon does win by a wide margin in the electoral vote count, 520 electoral votes for Nixon to just 17 for McGovern. The popular vote is closer, but still nowhere near any type of victory for McGovern. So Nixon wins handily. And so once the election ends, the fighting actually escalates, which goes counter to what Nixon said while campaigning, that within days of the election, that peace was imminent. And so to counteract this fighting, Nixon launches a furious 2-week bombing campaign of North Vietnam, including the capital city of Saigon, and he does so in hopes of basically forcing the North Vietnamese to the negotiating table, which they do, and they signed a ceasefire in Paris with the Treaty of Paris on January 23rd, 1973. And so with this treaty being signed, Nixon proclaims victory, saying we have peace with honor. We can't say full-out victory because North Vietnam still exists, and that was the whole reason the United States got involved in the conflict, is to counteract communism. And so once this peace with honor is in place, Nixon and the United States withdraw the remaining 27,000 troops that were still there. So the second portion of the reading you were responsible for was about the secret bombings of Cambodia and the War Powers Act. And so in July of 73, so 6-7 months after the Treaty of Paris was signed, it was learned that the U.S. Air Force had been continually conducting bombing raids on Cambodia, despite the fact that U.S. government officials, including Nixon, had sworn that the neutrality of Cambodia was being respected. And then Nixon is outright defiant. So despite this becoming public, Nixon continues to the large-scale bombing of Cambodia, and then repeatedly vetoes congressional efforts to stop him. And so this leads to Cambodia suffering greatly. It leads to death of its people, its economy being destroyed, upheaval within the country with revolutions taking place, and eventually a tyrannical leader, Pol Pot, takes control and actually abuses his power to the point that 2 million Cambodians are killed at his order. All this in the United States leads to the War Powers Act of 1973, which passed with enough support in Congress that it was able to override Nixon's veto, which that takes 2/3 of Congress to agree to override a presidential veto. So you have both Republicans and Democrats wanting to limit the power of the president. And so what it did is it required the president to report to Congress within 2 days after committing troops to a foreign conflict, or, quote, substantially enlarging combat units. So we still have some wiggle room there with that term, substantially. And so after reporting to Congress, Congress would have to end the authorization for the presidential action would have to end within 60 days unless Congress voted to extend it. So we're limiting the presidential powers. We also, now that Vietnam is over, the draft is, in terms of actual people being drafted, was ended in 1973. The Selective Service Act still does exist. So when boys turn 18, there'll be a little postcard in the mail that says that they do need to register, so that if there ever were a draft, theoretically, they could then be drawn for that draft. But the focus for the United States was to try and have a purely volunteer military service, which is what we have today. And they very much incentivized U.S. citizens joining the military. The last portion of the reading you guys had was about Watergate and Nixon's presidency coming to an end. So in June of 1972, 5 men were arrested in the Watergate apartment office complex before planting bugs in what was the Democratic Party's campaign headquarters. And Nixon's administration had become known for kind of unscrupulous dealings. And so we've obviously got the Watergate break-in, which we'll talk more about. The administration forged documents to discredit Democrats. They used the IRS to harass innocent citizens who were on what they called their enemies list. So basically sending the IRS out to do audits and making people's lives miserable for people who they viewed as enemies. The Pentagon Papers were a series of papers that were released to the newspapers that uncovered things that the government did not want uncovered. And so they burglarized, associates of Nixon burglarized the office of a psychiatrist who treated the person who released the Pentagon Papers to basically destroy his reputation. And then a lot of these things were covered up by the FBI and CIA, so misuse of government agencies to cover their bad dealings. The vice president for Nixon, Spiro Agnew, had to resign in October of 1973 because he was taking bribes, both while he was a state governor, but also while he was vice president. And so we've got a new vice president in place, Gerald Ford. The Constitution, the 25th Amendment, allowed for a planned succession. And so Gerald Ford was not elected to the vice presidency, but selected from Congress, nominated from Congress. In terms of Watergate, Nixon denied any knowledge of the Watergate break-in, which that's going to come back into play later. To kind of advance the story, when Nixon announces this, there's a White House lawyer who accuses White House officials of getting in the way of the truth coming out. And so this lawyer has a really good memory, and he has clear evidence that would indict the Nixon administration. Another White House aide reveals that there is a taping system in place in the Oval Office that had recorded most of Nixon's conversations. Nixon does not want this to get out, and so he cites executive privilege and refuses to hand over those tapes. And then he lashes out. In October of 1973, he fires his own special prosecutor, who was appointed to investigate the scandal, and other White House officials. And so you can maybe draw some parallels to the current administration and when things haven't gone their way, and how people tend to no longer have their positions any longer. And so Nixon, kind of realizing he's backed into a corner, he responds to the House Judiciary Committee's demand for the tapes, saying he will release what he considers the relevant portions. This is tried, goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says that Nixon does not have executive privilege that allows him to withhold potential criminal activity from the public view. And so Nixon is forced to comply. To try and get out ahead of it, he releases 3 of the subpoenaed tapes with conversations he had in June of 1972. One of the tapes he releases becomes known as the smoking gun tape because it has President Nixon on tape giving orders 6 days before Watergate took place to use the CIA to hold back the FBI from looking into it. So it's clearly showing that Nixon was involved in this process and involved in the cover-up of the Watergate break-in. Again, and so Nixon's own tape-recorded words convicted him of being involved. And so the House Judiciary Committee drew up the articles of impeachment based on obstruction of justice, abuse of presidential power, and then contempt of Congress, meaning he wasn't following what Congress was asking him to do. And this is all for information that Nixon thought apparently he needed, despite the fact he won the election by an almost 2-to-1 count in the popular vote, and way more than that in the electoral vote count. So the public obviously is very displeased with this, and so Republicans, members of Congress, so Nixon's own political party, conclude that he is guilty, and so they let him know he is going to be impeached, and so he's impeached by the House. Removal by the Senate is a foregone conclusion. His Republican Congress recommends he just resign, and so he does so. On August 8th, 1974, President Nixon resigns, and this is actually, obviously, is bad for the Nixon administration, but it shows that the constitutional powers put in place by the Founding Fathers could function properly. So the nation had survived a wrenching constitutional crisis. The Founding Fathers' impeachment machinery could work. And the idea that no person was above the law included the president. They were going to have to be held accountable for their actions, were strengthened. And so while this was a bad thing for the U.S. government, it was a good thing for the idealism behind the American government, and that America had elected someone who was did not uphold the values of the country, but the United States and the public and the government was able to fix itself. So that is it for those sections. We've got one more portion of reading over Vietnam that you'll get notes from.